Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Week 5 video lecture for a review or a survey of U.S. or American and British literature. All right, in this video, I have two kind of things to cover. The first half of the video, the longer half of the video, I want to review with you the discussion of The Model Millionaire by Oscar Wilde. That should take up most of the video. And then in the second half, I would like to briefly introduce our next reading for next week, and that is Kew Gardens by Virginia Woolf. All right, and I will attach the discussion questions for that, as well as some other notes in this week's files as well. Okay, so been reading through some of your discussion on Model Millionaire. I am encouraged and stimulated by that discussion, and I hope you have a similar reaction as well. This is absolutely my favorite part of teaching and experiencing literature, is the active discussion, the sharing of ideas, the opening of doors and windows into other perspectives of understanding. So allow me my own indulgence here. Again, I want to just review the questions that I posed for you. So I'm going to be doing the work here as well. Let's see. I think I have probably about 6 or 7 pages of notes. So forgive me if I go long. I will try to be as brief and to the point as I can, but as some of you may find, things do require a little bit deeper and deeper explanation. So bear with me, and of course, if you do have questions on top of some of these answers, feel free to ask about them, whether in the Kakao chat room or via email as well. And of course, I do want to emphasize, this is just really part of my understanding. All right, so you can emphasize both aspects there. It is just a small part of how I read this story, and it is my reading. So I do want to emphasize that this is still quite open to various different readings and applying your understanding and your reading as well. So don't take what I have to say as being the final word or the only way to understand this. That's not what I'm trying to say. I just want to add my experience and my reading to this discussion as well, and hopefully that can help you in some ways as well. All right, so the first question, as always, is just to try and give a basic summary, again, in your own words in English. All right, a bit of a note here. I know there are so many websites out there which will give you summaries and analysis and notes on these stories. I do encourage you to go and read about it, get secondary sources to help with your understanding, but please do not rely on these sites. Some are much better than others. Some are honestly quite useless. But no matter what you do, you're wasting your time if you just adopt those ideas as your own. All right? As a further note, if you're just cutting and pasting into our discussion, that is a complete waste of time, because you're learning nothing. Also, when it comes to the midterm test, the reflection, and the final test, any kind of cutting and pasting will get you 0 grades. So do not participate in that. Okay, that is an academic crime. It is plagiarism, and it really is a waste of your time when it comes to developing your skills as a person and as a student of literature. All right, so do your best, but make sure it's your voice. That's what we want to hear. Okay, any one of us can go to these other websites and get that information. But in terms of you as a student and a person developing, you have to do the work. You have to do the thinking. All right? No shortcuts. But again, in this discussion, there's no burden of being correct. It's about doing the work, spending the time, engaging in the literature. All right? Hopefully you can get some excitement and enthusiasm from that. All right? I know I do. Maybe you can feel that in the lecture and in these readings that I give you as well. All right, question 1, again, the summary here. The story, the model millionaire, begins with Oscar Wilde's witticisms on personality, marriage, and wealth. And these help to introduce the possible themes of the story and engage the audience in the discussion. So it's kind of a way of just getting your interest into the story, because he gives very direct statements, all right? Like romance is a privilege of the rich, or it is better to have a permanent income than to be fascinating. So regardless of whether you agree or disagree, you are forced to kind of consider these themes, these issues, with the directness which Wilde presents these and the grammar of his sentences. Okay, very direct and to the point. But that is kind of the introduction. Next, we are introduced to the protagonist, the main character, which we know is Hughie Erskine. Poor Hughie, as he is referred to. Right? Well, that's almost ironic, because later on we'll know he's not that poor. And what does it mean to be poor as well? Will be called into question. Just one of the many ways that Oscar Wilde plays with words, and that is what he is famous for. So, poor Hughie. We learn that Hughie is a wonderfully charming man, but apparently not too smart. He's handsome and popular, but not wealthy or intelligent. We also learn that he is in love with Laura Merton and wishes to marry her, but cannot because her father, the Colonel Merton, though he likes Hughie, will not allow Hughie to marry Laura unless Hughie can accumulate a minimum of 10,000 pounds, okay? Which is quite a lot of money for those times. As we know, Hughie doesn't have a job at this point. He lives on only 200 pounds a month from his aunt as a kind of inheritance or kind of an allowance. So 10,000 is what he needs. He only gets 200 a month. You can consider, even if you don't know how much the money's worth, there's a big discrepancy between 200 pounds a month and 10,000 that he needs to get married and hopefully be happy in that romance. All right, so we learn about Hughie's predicament, his situation, the background of the story, and then we get into the driving incident here. Hughie goes to visit his friend, Alan Trevor, while he paints a portrait of a man. All right. We learn kind of Alan Trevor is somewhat the opposite of Hughie, as he's intelligent, talented, and successful, but perhaps not particularly attractive. He's described as being rough. All right. On this morning, Trevor is painting what appears to be a beggar, a poor person from the street, and Hughie and Alan both marvel at the model. Alan Trevor marvels at the form and the romance of this beggar person. All right, just the beauty of his place as a person in the world. While Hughie really marvels in the empathy. Like they both exclaim, what a fantastic model, or what a marvelous model. It's the exact word. Sorry, I don't have the story here. Um, but they both marvel at the appearance of this marvel. It gets their attention. So there is kind of some connection there in their reaction to it. But Huey feels empathy, whereas Alan Trevor just focused on the appearance and how the beauty of that. When Alan Trevor steps away to talk to the framer, it leaves Huey in the room with the beggar, and Huey feels moved to talk to the beggar, and Huey offers the beggar the money he has, including the largest denomination of the coins in his pocket, the sovereign, with a couple of coppers. Right? And at that time, it's explained that Huey will have to make a sacrifice here and walk for a week rather than take taxis, which are described as hansoms. That's a word for a taxi. Right? He's going to have to walk for 2 weeks if he gives this money. So it's a sacrifice, but a relatively minimal one for him. But it's something that Huey does because he's a kind person who pities this beggar. All right, later that night, Huey meets Alan Trevor at a club, and he learns the truth about the model. Trevor tells Huey that he told the beggar all about Huey's situation with Laura, and more importantly, that the model is in fact one of the richest men in Europe, Baron Hausberg. All right, Huey is above all else embarrassed and wants to apologize to the Baron. All right, it's an interesting reaction, I think. Just for assuming that he was poor. He feels shame that he gave money to a rich man. All right, he's not angry, he's embarrassed in himself. All right, for embarrassing himself in front of such a rich and powerful man. And then the next morning, Huey is met by a servant of the Baron Hausberg. When the servant comes to Huey's home, and we learn that the Baron was so moved by Huey's wonderful, empathetic gesture that the Baron has now chosen to give Huey the 10,000 pounds that he needs to get married. And so Huey does get married to Laura. In fact, the Baron even gives Huey gives a speech at their wedding in the morning. All right, that's how moved he is by this wonderful, charming Huey. All right, so we can assume they live happily ever after, and that's your basic brief summary of the story. All right, now number 2, I asked you to pay attention to some of those witticisms that Wilde uses to begin the story. For example, Wilde writes, "Romance is the privilege of the rich, not the profession of the unemployed. The poor should be practical and prosaic." What does this mean to you, and do you agree with it? All right. In this story, maybe I'll begin my answer with another question. Does this hold true? Is it true, even though this is what's said at the beginning of the story? It's introduced as an idea, right? Consider this, right? Huey is not practical, right? He's not the poorest of poor, like a beggar, but he's not a rich person. He's kind of a middle-class person. Both he and Alan Trevor are kind of middle class. But Huey is not practical and prosaic. All right. So if this story is going to be all about how the poor have to be practical and prosaic, Huey is not practical and prosaic, and he is rewarded for not being practical and prosaic. If he were practical and prosaic, he would not have fallen in love with an impossible woman to marry. He would not put himself in that impossible situation. And he definitely would not have given such a significant sum of money to the beggar, but he does. So when you consider what happens in the story with our main character, the protagonist, Huey, it already goes against this idea that romance is the privilege of the rich and that the poor should be practical and prosaic. So this story doesn't really support that idea. And well, when it comes to me personally, I would say it's definitely practical advice, and as a poor person, it's certainly one that I would agree with, and I've seen it. I'm not a young man anymore. I've seen it play out in life. But, I have mixed emotions. I definitely agree with it, that it is practical and reasonable, but it's not something ideal, not something I want to see play out in life, but I can't deny that it is good advice, or at least a reasonable observation on society. All right, number 3. It is better to have a permanent income than to be fascinating. Another one of these direct witticisms that introduce the story. Now, this one I've offered as a discussion question just to be stimulating and try to have your own personal response be added to this discussion as a way of engaging in this story. So this one is purely based on personal opinion, and I was curious about how you might respond to it. So it really is quite subjective in general when you consider, what does it mean to have money and to be rich and boring compared to poor and interesting. So again, that whole statement is a little bit too general and a little bit too subjective. All right. For me, basically, I would say because it's so general and subjective, just give me the money. I'll take the money. I don't care who thinks I'm boring. What's more important is what I think. And given the comfort of money, I could find enough things to interest myself in as well. So I don't know. Maybe just give me the money, please. All right. Number 4. What does Wilde have to say about marriage and social class? All right. I'm asking you to put yourself in Wilde's mind, which is impossible. But it's an interesting question. So based on my reading of the story, mine alone, maybe you agree with me, maybe you disagree. But I think he really is attacking those statements. If we read the story, he's attacking those statements about romance being the privilege of the rich, not the professionally employed, or the poor should be practical and prosaic. Okay? He states that directly as a way of introducing as a theme, but I think the story attacks it. As I said in the summary, Huey does not follow that line of thinking. He is a kind of a romantic ideal, and he's not prosaic in what he does. And he is the hero of a story, and he does receive the reward of this story at the end, in its conclusion. So I don't think Wilde abandons the practicalities of wealth in materialistic society. I think Wilde obviously understands that this is good advice, but I don't think it's reasonable to govern our lives. I think he would expect a higher living for people. If life is worth living, I think he sees a higher ideal. Remember here that Wilde is an artist, and particularly an aesthetic. All right, I talked about aestheticism and gave you a bit of a definition there. He believes in art for art's sake, which is a fairly romantic belief itself. And if we talk about how um, we think about that in today's world, is it relevant here? I would say yes, it is wildly relevant. All right, no pun intended. In many ways, like the end of the 19th century, we have a very similar situation now. In there's a great discrepancy between the wealthy and the middle class and the poor. All right, that was a big problem as well. So his time that he's writing in 1887 for this story is very similar in the society's problem of the wealth gap or wealth inequality. So it would have been a topic of society then, much as it is a topic now. Also keep in mind here when we talk about marriage, traditionally marriage is not rooted in love, but it really is kind of rooted in bitter economic and political influences, right? The history of marriage is more about money and politics and social climbing than it is about two people falling in love, especially for the middle class and above, right? It's an exchange of power and economics to create some sort of social stability or improved social aspect. So keep that in mind as well. And that's relevant today. I think it will always be relevant, the idea of marriage and class and what that means in terms of economics and in terms of romance and how they might come in conflict in certain ways. So I think, again, going back to, Wilde's ideas, I would say he's kind of balancing the romantic idealism with very reasonable practicalities of living in society. And in his time, it was relevant, and in this time, it is relevant too. And I think it will always be relevant. We might be talking about this 300 years from now. If we continue to exist as society on this earth, it will always be relevant. All right. Number 5. Oscar Wilde was a part of an artistic movement called aestheticism. It is largely defined by a belief in art for art's sake, meaning that art only exists for its own intrinsic beauty. It does not need to be political or moralistic or serve any other purpose than to be beautiful in its own way. Does this story support that belief? Why or why not? All right, this is one of the trickier questions, I think. Now, I'm going to maybe be a little bit in conflict with myself. It might be a little bit paradoxical, or perhaps we could say Wilde is being ironic. This is kind of, again, my reading on the story. So I would say yes, okay? It does support the belief in asceticism. Now, let me explain this. This might be one of my longer answers here. I think Wilde inhabits the character of Alan Trevor, all right? Remember, Alan Trevor is an artist. He's a painter. He's a creator, okay? And in many ways, he is the kind of creator of this story. He is the reason that Huey meets the Baron, okay? And all of this takes place. So in some ways we can see Wilde being the creator. Just as he's the writer of the story, an artist, he is also, in some ways speaking through Alan Trevor. We can see, in Alan Trevor's witty ways too. In some ways it kind of mimics the voice of Oscar Wilde. In the French that he uses, Oscar Wilde spoke French fluently as well. Just in I think his Alan Trevor's philosophy on art mimics or echoes the aesthetic movement as well, and his role in the story in bringing these two men together, the Baron and Hughie, also kind of helps to show him as a creator. All right, so when it comes to aestheticism, I think it's a little bit ironic, because if we say aestheticism believes in arts for art's sake, and it doesn't need to be political or moralistic or serve a purpose, I think it's a little bit ironic, because I think the story does have a moral in that it supports aestheticism. So the story, its purpose is to kind of spread that philosophy, or espouse or support the philosophy of aestheticism. So it's kind of ironic or paradoxical in that way, but I think that's what this story does. And it does support aestheticism somewhat ironically by having a purpose to its story, to its plot. All right, so again, the character of Hughie is described as beautiful in spirit and in body, and he is the subject of the story, just as the Baron is the subject of Alan Trevor's painting. So you can see the kind of comparison there, right? As I said, I think Oscar Wilde inhabits the character of Alan Trevor. So Alan Trevor's subject is the Baron beggar, right? The millionaire model, or the model millionaire, and Wilde's subject, as the author of the story, is this rich man, poor man of Hughie Erskine as well. So you can kind of see the overlapping comparison there. And again, Hughie is described as physically beautiful and as a spirit too, but he's not particularly interesting or intelligent. But Hughie, as a character, does recognize beauty in the beggar and the model, right? When he sees that, he says, wow, what an amazing model. That's the word I was looking for earlier. Both Alan Trevor and Hughie agree that this beggar is an amazing model. So they appreciate the beauty of the art, right? Art for art's sake in this case, which is part of the aesthetic movement that Wilde supports or is a part of, okay? So this shows that Hughie appreciates beauty, even in the ugly tragedies of life, right? He feels the pity and the empathy for this poor man. And then, how is this story resolved? Well, we have Hughie, who gives the money to the beggar, and then Hughie is rewarded for his perspective, seeing the beauty in this tragedy, feeling this pure love of beauty, and upholding this perspective, this respect for aesthetics as well. So that kind of support, this happy ending, this positive outcome, really again goes to support the recognition of beauty. All right, so everybody is recognizing beauty in this story. All right, Hughie recognizes the pureness of the soul of the model. Alan Trevor recognized the beauty of the form of the model. We all know that Huey should be recognized for his beauty, even if he's not particularly interesting, because we don't need an intrinsic interest. He, as a subject alone, is beautiful, right? And then the beggar recognizes that and rewards Huey, and then we have the beauty of love as this kind of this resolution at the end. All right, so it's love and beauty. Nothing but love and beauty in the story. So if that is your outcome, then I could say that it really supports this idea of beauty for beauty's sake. All right, art for art's sake, just appreciation of beauty. All right, so I think this story does serve that purpose, which is somewhat contrary to the core of aestheticism, because I think it does violate aestheticism extreme principle that it doesn't need to serve a purpose or be moralistic or political or anything like that. But in fact, as a popular story, and this story reads very much like a common fairy tale, it does encourage and support the belief in aesthetics or art for art's sake. All right, I hope that's not too convoluted and confusing. I hope that makes some kind of sense to you. Again, that's my reading, so feel free to agree or disagree with that. I encourage your pushback or perhaps your agreement as well. Question 6 was about tone. What is the tone of the story, and how does Wilde establish it? All right, straightforwardly, I would say the tone is quite lighthearted and warm. We have the focus on beauty and a resolution of love and marriage. It is basically the story of the Good Samaritan. Huey is the Good Samaritan. All right, an old Christian story with that value of being charitable and generous. Okay, and this kind of love and beauty is rewarded. So it does uphold positive and social values. And on top of that, it's lighthearted and warm. Again, you have the marriage, which ends it, and it's full of humor, and the overall tone from the narrator really does create that. It also has a kind of self-awareness to it. If you kind of see, like I do, the artist Oscar Wilde as the narrator, or just as an artist, as a narrator, in the same way that you see the Alan Trevor as a painter, which I do. All right, so overall, lighthearted, warm, and humorous. All right, number 7, going back to humor. Can you find humor in the story? Give examples. I would say, yeah, it was fairly easy for me to read humor in this. Again, I'm a native speaker. I'm also fairly familiar with Wilde and his style, and he is very famous, one of the most famous wittier writers, and he loves to use puns. All right, puns, if you don't know, are word plays, right? Using words with double meanings or funny meanings or just changing meanings slightly in a witty way. All right, they're kinds of jokes in a way. So the humor is not always direct, and humor for non-native speakers is always difficult to pick up, right? In any kind of language, in my experience, and my experience teaching. Humor is one of the most difficult things because so much of that is cultural as well as linguistic. But I think as far as a straightforward example of a joke, there are some that are somewhat subtle. For example, I think maybe the clearest example would be when Huey gives the money to the beggar/model. Huey chooses to give him, knowing that he will have to make a minor sacrifice, and he says he will not be able to take hansoms. All right, Hansoms. Okay, that is a kind of carriage, which is a kind of taxi. All right. So he will, if he gives the money to the beggar, he will not be able to take taxis for 2 weeks, a fortnight. Okay. So that's the sacrifice he's making here. All right. And after leaving Alan Trevor's studio, Wilde writes, he, or Huey, spent the day with Laura, got a charming scolding for his extravagance, and had to walk home. Right? That's very kind of deadpan, cold delivery. But it's kind of a callback. Right? So when Huey's giving the money, he's like, well, I can't take a taxi for 2 weeks. And then in the narrator's description, we get this very deadpan, serious, and had to walk home. All right, and then there's actually callbacks. It's referred to again, right? I think in the next paragraph, it's brought up. All right, a callback is a kind of running joke. It happens again and again. It's repeated twice more in the story. Later on in the evening, Huey strolled or walked into the nightclub where he meets Alan Trevor and learns about the rich baron who was the model. And then after leaving the nightclub, Wilde chooses to include in his narration that Huey walked home after. So it's just this constant reminder. If you think about this, in terms of image, there are choices that are made. If you're writing the story, or as a director, if you're making a movie, what you show the audience. So he's emphasizing, kind of like humorously, these kind of little scenes, just Huey walking everywhere, after he gives that money, just as a kind of cute and subtle joke, running joke. All right, so I think that's one of the clearest examples of humor. But there's a lot of kind of pun work, right? In fact, the story ends with the pun, which some of you picked up on, right? Millionaire models are rare enough, but by Jove, model millionaires are rarer still. All right. So the idea that, the beggar was a model, a literal model for a painting, that's one understanding of the usage of a millionaire model. Okay, he's a model who is a millionaire. But then you have the model millionaire, the inversion of this term. Model means like a role model, an upstanding, excellent citizen of society, so generous and charitable in giving Huey the £10,000 for being a nice person. All right, so that is an example of a pun, a millionaire model, and a model millionaire. Okay, and that is, again, that kind of witticism and humor is very typical of Oscar Wilde's style. All right, for question 8, I asked you to characterize Huey Erskine. I've already done that in the summary and through some of the other explanations. I've already talked about a lot already. So just to review, basically, he is physically attractive, charming to men and women alike, not particularly bright, and not ambitious nor business-minded. And again, in my main reading of this story, my understanding of Huey as a character, I think he is a subject that is used by Wilde to show how any good person can be beautiful and, without being intelligent, recognize beauty in all forms. So they can participate in beauty that exists everywhere in the world, whether they're aware of it or not. Right? So go back to the idea of art for art's sake, without having to intellectualize it too much. All right, and again, that use of Huey as that kind of somewhat unintelligent but beautiful character helps Wilde to express or support his beliefs in aestheticism. All right, the last question was dealing with possible themes. Again, that really has a lot to do with you and your reading. Obviously, wealth, the idea of wealth and its effect on society. is important, or can be viewed as important, again, depending on how you read the story here. The idea of romance, or romance and wealth, and how those can, should, or can't and shouldn't be separated, I think could be a theme. Add to that the idea of materialism. We might say this is an anti-materialist story, right? Because it kind of espouses the need for charity and generosity in society. So it's a kind of social criticism of materialistic society. That's a possible theme that you could easily acknowledge. Another one here that I didn't touch upon much, I think it's minor, maybe it can be seen as major, again, depending on how you consider this story, but something to consider here is the idea of judging based on appearance as well, right? That's something to consider. And again, the one that I kind of focus on is I see this story as really an affirmation of appreciating beauty for beauty's sake. So it's kind of a story that espouses Wilde's beliefs in aesthetics, in aestheticism. All right, so that's my greater reading. That I think everything kind of contributes to that. All right, but again, these are just my opinions, and I hope I've explained them with a certain degree of clarity. Again, I could go on and on for many hours about this, and I would much prefer to do it in discussion form than in a lecture. But I hope you can take away something from this, or you can, maybe be stimulated, whether for or against me, to, again, vocalize and put your own thoughts into words as well. All right, let's move on. Part 2 of this video. I said I would introduce this week's reading. So let me do that briefly. I don't want to get too much into an introduction here, because if I get started, I might not stop. We are moving up into a different period of time. As I said with last week's lecture, Wilde was really writing at the end of the Victorian era, which was the end of the century. And with the new century, really, coincidentally, came a whole gigantic shift in the world, in culture, in literature, in writing. Massive shift, okay? And we are going to be stepping into the modernist period, and we are going to be reading the famous Virginia Woolf and her short story called Kew Gardens. Okay, Kew Gardens is a famous garden in London, public garden, lots of flowers, everything very beautiful. And it's written in 1921. So, again, I don't want to go too heavily into this, at least not in the video lecture. We've already gone long enough of you listening to me. But I have included some notes for this week's lecture. But I'm a little bit cautious about how deeply I want to encourage you to get into these, because the modernist period, it is so complex, not only for what happens in history and in culture and in literature, but really this is when the study of literature explodes. Okay, when we talk about like what you're doing now in university, this didn't happen until about 100 years ago. The reading of literature was really just considered the study of classics. Okay, keep in mind just technology, how many people could read in society, the availability of books in society, just really didn't exist until about 120 years ago. And then on top of that, once it did become easier for people to read and more people could read, and people began taking literature much more seriously, it really just blew up. It blew up in academia, in universities, as well as in society. And because of so many changes that were going on in this very important period of the 20th century, the modernist period, which in our society, Western society, is generally defined as 1900 to 1950. It's not exact, right? We can't say modernist period begins January 1st, 1900. That's not what happened. It was just these constant shifts. But at some point, we can kind of say, I don't know when, but things are different now than they were yesterday. All right? And we can consider that if you want to go 1895, fine. Some people can consider that 1900, 1905, sure. But around this time, there is a huge shift in culture, Western culture. And generally, the modernist period goes up to about 1950. Again, 1945, sure. Many people use that as a reference. There's no perfect days here. But we're talking about modernism here, and the peak of modernism, most people say would be around 1922, 1923. And modernism does include so many of the major canonized authors that are studied in universities today. And Virginia Woolf is one of those authors. So I have included her in our studies because she is so meaningful. I also wanted to be a little bit more diversified and not study just men and what they have to say. That's why I included Wilde too. Wilde is a homosexual. I want to get, kind of diverse perspectives as much as I can into this course because I think that's helpful. Because I want to emphasize diversity of opinion in understanding narratives, literature, stories. Okay, I want to hear your readings of these stories as well. So let's get diverse opinions. And here we have Virginia Woolf. And we're dealing with a very complex shift in literature in the period known as modernism. So in your notes, I have included not only the discussion questions for Kew Gardens, which is our reading this week, but I have included a general definition of what modernism is. And let me just give you the simplest definition as I know it. And modernism can be said to be a deliberate, on purpose, a deliberate and radical, extreme. So a purposeful and extreme break with some of the traditional bases, not only in Western art, but of Western culture in general. All right, so again, think about the period 1900 to 1950. We have the World War I. Okay, the world had never seen war like it did in World War I. It was repeated again in World War II, which was even worse. We saw the introduction of cars and airplanes, industrialization. That happened before, but it really took off. Urbanization, again, the movement of people into cities, took off. Mass production of things, literature, newspapers, the spread of information, right? This all happened very quickly, and it shook society. So dealing with that, the artists of the time really had to try and find new perspectives to try to understand this world. So modernism applies not only to literature, but to kind of all aspects of Western culture. Okay, but obviously this class, we're dealing with literature. And again, modernism is really too big to say exactly what it is. It's kind of an umbrella term Okay, it covers many, many different aspects, different attributes, characteristics of literature, right? And again, this is the time where English literature, or the study of literature, explodes. Okay, it becomes much more deeply studied by a greater variety of people who are writing. So I've included, and I'm a little worried about this, but I've included some attributes of modernist literature. Please note, I do not want to really burden you with trying to understand all of these attributes. Just read through them and just maybe do your best to try to understand them. They are complicated, especially if you're reading this and it's not your native language. If you're more interested in some of these aspects, that's great. Okay, go and research them further, look them up, look for examples. But I really just want to kind of point your attention to how complex modernist and literature, modernist literature becomes. And because we're studying Virginia Woolf, and in particular this story, Kew Gardens, I've also included kind of encyclopedia example of just one of the modernist techniques, one of the more popular techniques. So it's a style of writing. Okay, so modernism in general brought forth a greater sense of realism to the stories. So I think you'll notice a shift in how these stories are told compared to what we've read, which seem more traditional compared to this. And then we have stream of consciousness. All right, so stream of consciousness basically is a technique, a style of writing, a way of writing in which the writer is trying to really kind of mimic or imitate or recreate just how human beings think, right? Is trying to get into the interior of the human being, where most literature before the modernist time is really kind of straightforward, third-person narrator or first-person narrator. This story, let me tell you a story, all right? Here it is. One day this happened, then this happened, then this happened, okay? These stories, and with stream of consciousness, right? Just think about how you think. We don't have that kind of very linear, easily organized, coherent communication. It's a lot more of just thoughts coming out of nowhere, going nowhere, and another thought replacing that thought. Okay, so you might recognize that in this story. So if you're curious about some of the more academic aspects of modernism, and particularly stream of consciousness, of which Virginia Woolf is considered a master of stream of consciousness, these notes are included. But my purpose here is just to make you aware of some of the things that are happening in this story, okay, and why writers are writing this way. But remember, our project in taking this course is most importantly to read and engage in this story. Your engagement in this story is my interest, okay? But again, when it comes to analyzing and giving your opinion, okay, we can't just say anything without trying to be intellectually sincere, trying to prove it by taking our thoughts and thinking about them clearly and trying to explain them and explain it with what we see in the text. So again, any reading, any opinion is wonderful and acceptable. I really just want to see you engage in the story. But as an exercise, as a way of becoming a better student of literature, challenge yourself and challenge your classmates to clarify their points of thinking and find evidence in their story to back it up. All right, and as always, go back to week 1, consider the different aspects of plot, character, imagery, symbolism. So if you read a story like this and say, I don't know what to say and I don't know how to say it, take a deep breath, relax, start with plot. Again, summarize the plot. Think about characters, define the characters. Think about setting. Think about possible imagery and descriptions. Think about possible symbolisms. Be more specific with how you analyze it, because it's much easier to say something rather than say, oh, what's the story about? I don't know. It's about everything. It's about nothing. All right? Find a more specific aspect, and then you might find it easier to find a voice or a way to express your ideas. Okay, so that's what we're going to do, just like we have done for the first 2 stories. Let me give you the discussion questions for Kew Gardens. Again, first, just read the story. Try to enjoy it as much as you can. I hope you do. Read it once. Make a summary of the story in your own words. Stress that, in your own words, in English. And then read it again and maybe again, and just ponder it and let your own thoughts come to mind, and see if you can pin down why you think that way. All right, so let me give you some example discussion questions which you can respond to, or you can answer and respond to this week in Kakao chat room. All right, before next Wednesday. Again, that's kind of what we want to do every week. So, as always, number 1, briefly summarize the story in your own words in English. Number 2, why is this story called Kew Gardens? What is important about the setting, right? Why do you think the author chose this garden as a setting for her story? Number 3, what is an important description for you in the story, and why? I think you will notice that there's a lot more kind of conscious description, active description going on in this story. Some might think it's too much, but I think there is enough of it that it gets your attention. All right, especially where the author chooses to shine her light or to emphasize with her words. Okay, and number 3, I'm asking you basically about, give me an important image. Okay, image is description. It's the recreation of the world for the reader. Okay, through the various senses. And if you remember talking about imagery, imagery is often, not always, but often kind of the door to symbolism. And symbolism is where you have something, concrete thing, that represents another thing. It has another meaning, or many representative meanings, depending on your reading, your interpretation. Okay, so number 3 might introduce number 4, or it might not, or you might want to talk about 2 totally separate things. But number 4, identify an important symbol and explain what it means according to your reading of the story. All right, so again, symbols is when you look at one concrete thing, like, aha, this is a pen. Okay, so 1, it is a concrete object. It is a thing. 2, what does it represent? All right, it represents my hard work of writing out 8 pages of notes to make this video. All right, or it represents my failure to be an artist and therefore to have to be a teacher. Those who can't do, teach, as the saying goes. All right, so find a thing and then explain what it represents. All right, or it could represent many things. but according to your interpretation of the story, what does it mean and why? Number 5, characterization. So what do the different groups of characters add to the story? All right. Specifically, there are kind of 4 groups of human characters to consider in the story. You might consider the insects and creatures of Kew Gardens to be characters as well. You may in fact consider the garden itself, the environment, the setting to be a character itself. All right, so I don't want to influence you. But what do the different groups of characters add to the story? What can you say about them? How do they influence or interact with the telling or reading of the story? And number 6, all right, let's get into comparisons here. Comparative literature. This is our 3rd story so far. So I'm curious to see how you would compare this one to others that we have read. So I want you to compare this story, Kew Gardens, to one or both of the stories that we've read so far. So compare Kew Gardens to The Apparition of Mrs. Veal by Defoe, and compare it to The Model Millionaire by Oscar Wilde. You can compare it to just one of the stories, or you can compare it to both of them if you're feeling that. Great. But what I want you to do, because in your discussion, if we just say compare it to both, that's going to be too broad a discussion. So to be helpful here, let's be more specific. So maybe choose one aspect of the story, such as plot, character, imagery, symbolism, setting, etc., or the style of the author, and just focus on that aspect in this story, and with maybe The Apparition of Mrs. Veal or The Millionaire model. Okay, let's get into comparison there. All right, so do your reading, and then please have a good think about this, and then populate our Cacao chat room with all of your wonderful, interesting, and stimulating readings and interpretations on Kew Gardens by Virginia Woolf. All right, try to get those up by the following Wednesday. Okay? All right, thank you for watching. Take care, everybody.